Hi, this is Jeff Greenewalt, chair of the History Consortium. And our next program is about the folks in York County, Pennsylvania after the Civil War and what their life was like. And our presenter tonight is Mr. Jim McClure. He is a retired editor of the York Daily Record and the York Sunday News and its associated digital products. He is the author and co-author of 9 books on the history of York County, and he holds a master's degree in American Studies from Penn State Harrisburg, where he did research on the history of journalism in York County, Pennsylvania. So let's listen to Jim.
Thank you very much. This is great to be here. This is a very prestigious group to talk to, and I just get little tingles every time I get an invitation to talk to the group that goes back to at least the late 1990s, I believe, and is responsible in part for the Renaissance and Civil War in the Civil War in York County, the interest in Civil War in York County that's taken place in the last 25 years. The topic tonight is after the Civil War, successes and struggles of York County's people. And we're really going to talk about the Victorian era or the Industrial Revolution, however you want to talk about that. And I know that I have a couple of audiences. I have some Civil War, some really avid Civil War people, and I'm going to talk about the Civil War for sure. But there's also audiences here that want to know more about this, what happened after the Civil War that wasn't necessarily Civil War connected. So I'm going to try to thread the needle here. And as always, I really do relish questions as we go. So if you have a question, if I'm not clear on something, just raise your hand or just blurt it out and put it on the chat online, and Adam will ask me the question as we go too. So what we're going to start here, and we're going to do a couple things here tonight, a couple goals. One is that the Civil War from 1865, after the Civil War to about 1930, was a disruptive moment, but shaped York County as we know today. We'll talk about that. York County was really resilient in rebuilding from a terrible Civil War. The emergence of Civil War vets and home front volunteers were among the community leaders that emerged after the war. And we really need to think of it as somewhat of a jagged upward arch, not necessarily a straight arc towards progress or towards a better community, but one that was up and down, but it did peak right before the Great Depression. So we'll be talking about all that. And this won't be a talk about industrial giants. We see some of those industrial giants up here. And that's a way a lot of people might talk about the Industrial Revolution after the Civil War. And surely they were fueled by some of the things that happened during the Civil War, including some of the folks that came back from the Civil War and were really good employees. But we're going to go beyond that as we'll see. One of the things that we'll look at immediately is that, sometimes we think about York County as a colonial town, because of the Yorktown Hotel and all the Duke Street and Queen Street and all that, and York Revs. But really, York is a Victorian era town. Many of the things that we know about in York today, the row houses, many of these houses along the streets, the main streets, and even our factories were built after the Civil War. We're really pretty much a Industrial Revolution town, and but we really do celebrate our colonial era, and we should, and it was a great era. But there might be more houses than this, but when you look over here, these were the houses that are left that were around in the colonial era in New York. There might be a couple more, but these are the main ones: the Golden Plow Tavern, Gates House, Cookie's House, and Willis House. But most of our housing stock, most of our buildings came after the Civil War. And we do have an anomaly here and there. We do have the York City Hall, which is that Williamsburg type of design, that trying to bring back that colonial era. But really most of our stock. This is the this is the old Colonial Hotel here in the corner in the square. That's a Dempworth building. Dempworth was a major architect during the Industrial Revolution, the Victorian era. And then this was done by another Dempworth, second generation Dempworth. So these are houses, these are places that we're more used to seeing from around here today that came up after the Civil War. A couple things to point out here when we look at population, and this is county population here. When we look at 1870, we can see that the population trend went down in 1870. Anybody know why? Yeah, war and the disruption of the war. I mean, that's a pretty big drop there from what we were seeing, and then it rebounded again. And then 1920, look what happened to our population. We know that with World War I and the Spanish flu. You know, if anybody ever finds a Spanish flu number for the county, I'd like to know if it's a mortality number. I haven't been able to find a good number, but you can see what it did to the population, the war and that together. So we can see the war had an impact on our population. Then if we look at, you know, this the numbers for, this is just for the city. And we can see in 1870, the city actually went up right after the Civil War. And, you know, anybody have a reason for that? Why would that be? The city went up, the county went up a little, went up some, but, you know, it was comparable, a little bit lower than many of the big years after the Civil War. Anybody have a reason? Why do you think that we had such a large growth in this? And it wasn't a city; it was a borough at that point. It wasn't a city until 1887.
Migration.
Yeah, there was, well, migration. The great migration of blacks and rural whites to the York County came 19 teens, something like that. Came a little bit later. It was a different type of migration where people tended to go from the towns, you know, from the countryside into the towns. We'll see that in a second, including York. Plus, there was post-war build-up. I mean, the soldiers got back and they had families, and you know, they were 4 years older and so on. We'll talk about the Great Migration. In fact, we'll talk. There's some pictures up here that kind of suggest that these figures here, well, especially Bonnie Grimes here. These came, you know, Bonnie Grimes came here in the 1920s as part of the Great Migration that Jeff was talking about. And we had 2 schools built. This is the Smallwood School right here, and this is the Aquila Howard School. We have 2 black segregated schools that were responsible to that. So that would have happened. That migration would have happened starting here, and it would have, you know, we probably would have had a population loss if we wouldn't have had that migration, the Great Migration from the South coming. And then you can see in 1930 and 40, you know, you can see that we got back on even during the Great Depression. So, you know, but I think in terms of the Civil War, and this is one of the reasons why I think this, because many of our boroughs after the Civil War, all these boroughs, these were villages, but they became boroughs, they incorporated as boroughs after the Civil War, and including this period that we're talking about. So everything in bold happened after the Civil War. So you have people that were on farms let's say the husband was away fighting in the war, and where would you go? You know, we have evidences that they would go into the nearest village, and you know that's where they would stay. So it might have been that they stayed in there, they left the farm to go into the villages, and that's why these towns grew, you know, including New York. You didn't feel safe out in the country with the you know, the guy away, and you're on the farm, so you go in and live with your family members. And it's possible that they stayed during that time frame. In general, York was growing, so people had to live somewhere, and they tended to go into the towns and the villages in this time frame. Is that surprising to anybody? Does that make sense? You know, when you look at all those boroughs, we have 36 boroughs, and most of them formed during the Civil War or after the Civil War, right after the Civil War, including, you know, Jacobus, exemplified over here. It was the newest one in 1929. York during this period became from a borough to a city in 1887. York was a borough in 1787, became a borough, and then became a city in 1887. So this, we'll come back to this picture a little bit later. But this was the celebration at the time that York was becoming a city, right after the Civil War, 1887. Now this is I could show slides here all night, and you all could too, about all the things that happened during this period. I just chose this one representative slide that all 4 of these schools in York formed during this period. We're talking about 1865 to 1930. You know, this is the original York School. It's still standing on South Duke Street. It's across from Bonnie Grimes' gym, the campus park. And this one was down on Philadelphia Street, West Philadelphia Street, down from Central Market. It burned down in about 1942. This school was on the corner of I get these streets mixed up. A college in George, and this was Hannah Penn. When it came down in the 1960s, it was built as York High in 1899. And then we have the original. We have William Penn or York High, built in 1927, all during this post-war period. So again, this is I'm trying to show how important this period was right after the Civil War. Okay, now the impact of the Civil War. This was it showed a great resiliency, because I think we can often just, the war is over with, the guys came home, the women left the nursing things that they were doing in the military hospital. You know, there's some degree of normalcy, right? Well, there was a heck of a price that the community was suffering. Now, I want to try to bring that home. I tried to bring that home by doing some math. And if you just take, these are Dennis Brandt's figures, if you take the number of casualties, captured, wounded, and dead, and you apply them to today's population, it'd be equivalent today. 2.5% of the population were casualties of the war, dead, missing, and wounded. That'd be 11,000 people today. Does that give you a sense? 11,000. What happened if we had that type of casualty rate in York County today? You know, you know, 11,000. You know, the number is, let's see, the number serving is 6,000, and that would be equivalent. That would be 9%. Of the population, which would be about 45,000 people would have served. 45,000 people today, if there was a war today, 45,000 people serving. In a comparison point, and this isn't an easy one, but the comparison point, this is the number of those that were killed in Middle East wars, about 30 people. So you take that versus the 11,000 who would have been casualties in the Civil War. See what I'm getting at there? It was a major thing for the community to deal with, this carnage. Even if they came back, they were sick. And we'll see some examples of that in a second. I want to talk about the surrender. This isn't about the surrender of York. But you know the story that Juba Early's division was knocking on our door. We sent a delegation out to surrender the town out near what's today East York Airport. They came to the town and extorted, you know, goods and all kinds of things, and cash in the amount of $28,000. So we were dealing with that still. You know, there's still division in town over that. And here's one example that I can point to. The surrender was controversial then. You can say it's controversial today. But here, this is David Small, who was Chief Burgess at the time. This is his obituary in 1885. And it talks about, in an obituary, it says that he incurred the displeasure of a number of our people by visiting the invading forces of General Early, some distance west of York, in the interest of the weaker portion of the population whose fears had well nigh created a panic. So here we are in his obituaries defending his decision. You know, so this is 1885, 20 years after the war was over with. And of course, we know, we'll see A.B. Parker a little bit later on defending the decision. And even today, you know, here, this is the debate took place in 1988. You have Mark Snell saying, Yorksville Bot's decision cost the town's honor, catalyzed by future industrialist A.B. Parker. You know, so here we have Mark Snell. Juba Early was bluffing, and they fell for it. He would not have set fire to that town. We have this guy from the Bar Association saying York did what York does best. York treated the Civil War as a commercial enterprise, and so on. We had that debate going on even today. And it's a good debate. We should be talking about it. In fact, we didn't talk about it for a while, for a long part of the 20th century. And as I always say, when you don't talk about the Civil War until the Civil War Roundtable got going, until Scott Mingus started his tsunami of books and so on, until that started, we weren't talking about the Civil War. And when you don't talk about the Civil War, what don't you talk about? You don't talk about race. You don't talk about our past successes or failures on the racial front. The Civil War kind of elevates that discussion. We didn't do that in the 20th century for the most part. And that's another program in itself, but I'll show you some, but here you can see they're debating it back in 1988, 125th of the Battle of Gettysburg. Okay, so here's some of the other disruptions that are taking place after the war. Johnny comes marching home, right? Here's what they faced. We have all these, I don't know how anybody came up with this number of 1,000 horses, but that's what I've used that number. I think Scott Mingus has used that number. But that's like 1,000 tractors today. That would be a 2-mile long parade of horses. I think that'd be a parade of horses from here to Red Lobster or something, that long of a parade. I looked at horses 8 feet in length, and you do the math, and that's a lot of horses and a lot of tractors, right during harvest season. We had 11,000 of these Confederate soldiers tramping our fields, stealing our stuff, and the families were disrupted. We had to have an orphanage as a result of that. We'll talk about that in a second. And then this is a number that I just think we ought to really, I always like to bring it up. In Hanover, there were more than 300 casualties, 10 missing and wounded, 300 in one day. Imagine if you're a youngster or anybody in town experiencing that type of thing right below your townhouse as you look down, right on your farmland. And so that was a large battle, a cavalry battle right here in York County. Imagine that. It's just hard. 300 people. That's a big number of people. Now, here's some of the other things that went on. This is June Lloyd. She wrote in her book, Faith and Family. I won't read all of this, but this just shows change. And it was a disruptor. I think in some ways it is a disruptor in York County, like the York race riots were in the late 60s. Not all disruptors are bad. So disruptors can be good because they get you out of the status quo. And I think that's the point June is making here. For example, she says, Pennsylvania German men were uprooted from their familiar communities. Even those who escaped battle saw other places and met Americans different from themselves. And they were no longer Germans who get along speaking Dutch. They were Americans. And then, the need for war materials that accelerated the growth of the northern industry. Young men left their small communities to work alongside others in the factories. Therefore, we have the growth in the boroughs, right? We have growth in the city. York County Children's Book, English learned in the public school, established as a result of the 1834 Act. Only the old folks spoke Dutch. The young people were Americans. They dressed, spoke, and worked alike. A lot of change going on around here in 1865 in the years after that. Any thoughts on that? Comments? Did you ever think about that way? Yeah, Adam.
It's often standard interpretation in histories of World War II as well.
Right.
That, war has this Americanizing effect. And, there are all those World War II movies. They're kind of caricatures, they're almost cartoonish to an extent, but you always have these different stereotypes from different places in the country. There's a Southern, white Southern. Yeah. There's a guy from Brooklyn and there's a guy from Indiana, and they all end up being this cohesive fighting unit. Right. And at the end of the war, then they're Americans. So, I mean, it's not, it's a movie trope, but it also has this basis of history.
Yeah, and World War I was like that because we were heavily German. We were fighting the Germans, really fighting the Germans. And then after that, we came home. We had the Roaring 20s. It just kind of changed us. And there was, if you were a German in the 19 teens in York County, you were suspect, because you would often have families over in Germany in World War I. So war has that disrupting effect. The disruption can be good in some ways. It can also be painful. And so it's a two-edged sword there. We had a kind of a strange dualism here, not strange maybe, but a dualism here in York County. We hated the war. Politically, we hated the war. We voted against Abraham Lincoln both times, as you know. But it's present, but this was the Democratic paper. Now, they were trying to make the war sound pretty bad. This is early in the war. I don't think it was quite this bad yet. But look what there's, I don't know, maybe it's like, I don't know, Fox and CNN today. You try to make it look as bad as one side or the other, bad as you can. Its present results are in discord, confusion, the ruin of trade, the closing of workshops, the production of want, destitution, poverty, demoralization, humiliation, and shame, and so on. Yeah.
It's interesting, the date, that's only 11 days after Fort Sumter.
Yeah, they were taking a political position. Obviously, the Democrats were in the majority in York County, so they were playing to the Democratic base. That's what they were doing. You know, we talk like that today, but that's what they were doing back then. But we love the warriors, you know, in York County. And this is a really important moment. We'll talk about this later too. The women of York also pitched in with enthusiasm, forming what may have been York's first women's organization. These women organized other women who in turn went about the task of collecting or making stockings, shirts, bandages, and so on, according to Mark Snell. June Lloyd will tell you, well, there were women's groups before that. In the churches, for example, the churches had women's groups. But I think maybe Mark Snell was talking here about community-wide groups, so ecumenic groups that were working on the war. So we love the warrior, but in the majority in York County, we didn't love the war. So that didn't go away right as soon as the war was over with. You know, we still had that here. And this is an example of that. I won't go into all this detail, but we had a Democratic mayor, and then at that point he was in the majority. This is David Small, also owned the newspaper, which is the predecessor of the Daily Record, I might add. And you can see his stats there. And his position was the Union as it was, the Constitution as it is, and then Negroes where they are. That was the position of York County at the time. It's called a Copperhead position. It basically was a peace Democrat position. We don't like this war. It's not worth going to war with. Just leave slavery in place. Don't bother us with it. That would be the position of the majority position in York County at that time. And then we have this David Small, David Etter Small, another David Small. And he made railroad cars, and he lived in the brownstone next to the Martin Library. And he was very much a Union man. If I can bring down a partridge with a gun, I certainly can shoot well enough to go to the defense of my country. And so he and David Small, David Etter Small ran against David Small in 1867. David Small won. David Small, the Democrat, won. So even after the war, we were politically against the war. Even after all that, we were on the Democrat side still. We had a referendum in 1867, and we chose not to back the party of Abraham Lincoln.
And they were not in the same family then.
They were cousins, maybe second cousins, same family, second cousins, not close cousins. I think there were 7 brothers, and they were from different brothers. Yeah. But the Small family was pervasive in those days, and some of them were Republicans, and some of them were Democrats. We just saw. Yeah. So, this just gives a kind of a sense of where we are at the end of the war. This is A.B. Farquhar in his autobiography, First Million the Hardest. We'll talk about him towards the end. But it was only 100 years ago that came out. Just keep that in mind. And he said, basically, we'll get back to business after the war. It's a question of months, not of years. And I think he was right about that. Business started humming. And he said there was work for everyone. And so the soldiers came back. There's the last great review in Washington. The country began to hum with business. So that was what was happening. A little bit like World War II, after World War II, when the soldiers came home. We're going to go here and talk about a GOAT. Everybody knows that Tom Brady is the greatest football player, the greatest of all time, right? Especially if you're a Patriot Tampa Bay fan. Then who's the greatest philanthropist of all time in York County? Well, one of them emerged during right after the Civil War, in the period we're talking about, and and this was Samuel and Isabel Small. Now we had P.A. Small and Samuel Small. P.A. and S. Small, they were merchants. They owned mills, and they also owned iron mines, and they were the Small family we've been talking about. They are the main branch of the Small family, if you want to think about that way. And they founded 4 different entities. We'll talk about these one at a time really quickly. York Benevolent Society, Children's Home of York, York Legion Institute, and the York Hospital. So you had one guy and his wife who did all of that. Basically got the ball rolling on all that. So it goes to show how things changed after the Civil War in York County. Imagine today, most of us would be hard pressed to say this person started this business, and it's just imagine the scope of what they did, what they were able to do. This is a children's home in York. It was founded in 1865, and it was at Pine in East Philadelphia. Now it's a shop at. And the thing about this number, this is 1875, 10 years after the war, the remainder of the school at present, 57 children, 31 of them being soldiers' orphans. Does that show you the devastation of the war? 10 years after the war, we still have 31 folks in our children in our orphanage. And over here, we don't have time to read it. It talks about how some of them aged out, some of them went here, or some of them went there. But those were those that were left. So a lot of people that were in that orphanage, a lot of kids that were in that orphanage after the war. In fact, I think that I would, if anybody's looking to write a master's thesis, I think the story, when you have a nephew or a son or daughter that are thinking about doing a master's thesis, there's a lot to be done about the children, the poorhouse in York County, the almshouse, the social history of these institutions we're talking about here and others. York Benevolent Association is still with us, and it was formed in 1863 from an aid for widows and orphans of Civil War soldiers. We have the York College. This is York Collegiate Institute. You all know where Campus Park is, the Bonnie B. Grimes gym. That was those were associated with this building here, which is York Collegiate Institute. There was an earlier building that burned down, and this was a Denver building that went up in its place. It's now a playground. They tore it down. It's now a playground. And this was York County Academy over here. It's on Beaver Street. It's now a parking lot. Its gym still is there in the back of that parking lot. So Samuel Small made that happen. And then you have York Hospital. And this is really a good area for study, because we had a major military hospital here in York County. What was the connection to that military hospital and York Hospital? There were definitely common surgeons, but it was 15 years in between there. So I don't know. I haven't done enough to know what the link was, except there were common doctors. And so that would be a good area to probe, how the military hospital inspired York Hospital. Samuel Small and his wife, and they were definitely involved. Isabel Small were definitely involved in care for those at the military hospital, interested in that. How did that spur the founding of York Hospital? That's a really rich area. After we know that in 1865, the military hospital came down. This shows dismantling of the hospital, of the military hospital. This shows a gazebo in the background that remains standing a little bit longer. And this article basically says, hey, the military hospital, they owe us a lot of money anyway for hosting them for all this time, but they did build us a park. There's improvements to the Penn Park. They made a park for us. Let's go ahead and improve it, and so on. And they have sidewalks in place and things like that. They have trees that they planted. And so that was an impetus for improvements to Penn Park. The real improvements to Penn Park didn't happen until after York became a city. And that's when the soldiers, there's the gazebo, a little bit better picture of the gazebo there. The Penn Park really came up somewhat after 1898, after York became a city. And that's when Penn Park really was improved. And that's how Penn Park was when it was at its heyday. That you can see the dimensions. This I didn't know this up to this point, but the female figure at top there is 10 feet high. I just never thought about that. It looks small. She looks smaller, but 10 feet high. That's big. So that's just a trivia fact there. But we have that monument, and we have the Salem Square monument. And what I'm trying to say in this section is that we have really very little Civil War memory here. We have a couple statues, Salem Square. Sorry, the head was cut off. I just couldn't find a better picture. But this is still standing in Salem Square. But it's not really a Civil War statue per se. It's an American Revolution statue and a Civil War. It draws a line between the York Rifles of the American Revolution and the York Rifles of the Civil War. And so it's a joint statue. It's not a pure Civil War place. there, but it's still, it's a very lovely little pocket park there in the Salem Square area. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that area is an interesting area. That's yeah, and that area is coming back in many ways. There's a lot of work to do out there. At one time, it was kind of the place to be. Salem Avenue is out there, and the Salem Avenue runs to York, New Salem. It's the old road to York, New Salem, and so and this is another statue, of course. This is a statue of Prospect Hill Cemetery. But think about this for a second. Out of those three, how many other Civil War memorials do we have around New York City? And think about you know, the number. I didn't count them recently, but at one time there was 13 markers or some type of memory fixture in Continental Square area to the American Revolution. I think there may be a wayside marker to the Civil War in the Center Square area, the Continental Square area. Wonder why that would be. Why do you think that would be? We have three of these monuments kind of out in the suburbs of New York City, and we have all this colonial stuff in the center part of New York City. Why would that be?
Remember that they were anti-war.
Right. Right. Yeah, and that surrender loomed. You know, we had other things that we had a great American Revolution past. We had a great World War II past. You know, let's spend our time on those. Our Civil War past in New York, not necessarily Hanover, but in New York was, you know, it wasn't something that we really were proud of. In fact, we didn't really emphasize it for, especially in the 20th century. Yeah.
I mean, an excellent comparison is the Square of Lancaster. You know, and I can't remember the official title, but that elaborate monument with sailor and soldier that's right in the middle of town.
Right. You think of Chambersburg, it has a Civil War soldier right in the square. Bedford does as well. There's a Civil War monument in its square. Of course, Gettysburg. But, you know, our square is kind of vacant of the Civil War. It's Civil War memory. So all those little things add up to say, doesn't mean the Civil War wasn't important. I just spent the last 20 minutes or whatever talking about the importance of the Civil War, but there was pain associated with the Civil War. Now, also, this was a time that the Goodriches, a very prominent Black family, moved out of York. They moved up for various reasons. They joined their sons up in Michigan, where they had a photographic business, and Glen Alvin was part of that photography. They started that photographic business when they were here in New York. The Smithsonian's taken notice of that, and we'll see a lot more about the Glen Alvin Goodrich name around York County. But interestingly, during the same period, Glen Alvin's son moved back. His name was Glenn Goodrich. He moved back, and he was a prominent, I think he was a barber as well. He was a prominent person in Faith Presbyterian Church. So the Goodriches left and they came back. Other family members came back as well. And some of them, at least three of them, are buried in Lebanon Cemetery, the historically Black cemetery. You know, there's two GAR posts. We'll talk about the David E. Small post first. We already talked about David Small being, you know, this abolitionist, this friend of, he was thought to be an Underground Railroad operator. He was a pro-union man. And so John, so the Black let's see, GAR post. Sorry about that. I couldn't see that for a second. The Black GAR post named their post after him, which is extremely rare to do that in America. Stephen H. Smith's done some really good work on that. And then Captain William Lanius did some work. He was kind of started the Sedgwick post, the white post. And there's this image I think that Stephen Smith might have drawn, or maybe Jeff did, I'm not sure. But on Memorial Days, they had joint ceremonies. You know, they would come together on Memorial Day to honor the dead. And then they'd march up the North George Street Hill. And the white unit, the white GR post, would go to Prospect Hill Cemetery. And the Black post would go, the soldiers would go up to Lebanon Cemetery. They walked up the hill even further. So they kind of split off. We'll talk about Lonnius a little bit later, but he was probably one of the most prominent fighting men and became a successful businessman after the war. Long and short of Lonnius was that he his family owned one of the lumber yards in Wrightsville that burned during the Confederate conflagration of Wrightsville, when the bridge burned and caught Wrightsville on fire. And then he ended up owning a lumber yard up in Williamsport and owned other lumber businesses. And so he built the avenues out, but he built the avenues out because the trolley line ran out there and he owned the trolley line. So you had one guy that owned lumber yards to build the houses. He built the houses, ran a trolley line out there to service the houses so they could work in the factories. I did look to see if he had a part of the wire cloth industry, because the story is you had these horse-drawn trolleys that created a lot of flies, the horse manure and so on. So you need screens. So that's why New York Wire came into play and other wire cloth manufacturers. So that would have been a hat trick if you had stock in the wire cloth too. But I couldn't find that. Maybe someone else knows. And this is Lebanon Cemetery. There's 300 veterans there. This is a cemetery where the David E. Small marchers went to, and many of them are buried there today. Interestingly, Samantha Gorham says that there was segregation even in death. That's a historically black cemetery. We had the historically white cemetery. We had the Prospect Hill Cemetery. But anyway, that went in after the Civil War, and there are a lot of Civil War veterans buried there. I'm still in the trolleys here because I just think this is so interesting, and this shows New York Wire, which went up because of the trolleys, the horse-drawn trolleys, but also we had all kinds of other horsepower here, the stables and all over the place, and and you can still see those trolleys. York trolley is still running over in Rock Hill Furnace in Huntington County, and you can go and see where the wire cloth was made in New York Wire Works. It's been remodeled now. It's restored. It's quite a place to go in there. So you see, I always like to put show and tell and go and do things in these presentations. You can go and actually experience a trolley that came up during this post-war period, and you can go and look at this, go into a shop and see it's very primitive still, very nice, very primitive. You can still smell the grease and so forth. It's very industrial like in there, but actually very nice in the New York Wire Works. So it's a place to go. Now, I talked about Henry Lonnius founding the avenues. He was, of course, with 87 Pennsylvania. He was a captain in 87. These are some of the things that started in the avenues: the York Government Patties, the Outdoor Country Club, the Office of Edmund Rivera, Memorial Hospital started there, and Rudy Yard Glass, which is a major stained glass maker. So Henry, all I'm trying to say here is that William Henry, we call him Ken Lonnius, kind of created an environment there in the avenues that all this stuff incubated from after the war. So you can see a lot of momentum building here after the war, right? I'm going to really move on quickly here. This is just some of the physical disabilities that persisted after the war. And this is just one. James Barton from U.S. colored troops, the war broke his health and he received $6 a month, a pension check. He was put on duty. His face and head did not seem right. Is what happened, was the diagnosis of him during the war. And he went through the war, came home, got $6 a month pension, had to fight for it. And then we had this Medal of winner, honor winner, John Henry Denning, who June Lloyd says there at the end, it makes you wonder if it's a post-traumatic stress disorder. He kind of went, he went and started a newspaper that was libeling of folks, and they took him to court. He ended up winning, but he just was not what you would normally say it was right. He didn't come back in good shape, and that continued that way. And he's buried in Prospect Hill Cemetery as well. So these things did linger. This is we had a 2-star general here, William B. Franklin. He headed 2 corps at Fredericksburg that was called a Grand Division, and he was a York native. And he he didn't stay in New York. He's buried in New York, Prospect Hill Cemetery. He went on to become Chief of Colt Firearms. He died in 1903. So he lived, not many Civil War generals lived into the 20th century. He's one of the unusual, rare ones that did. And I always like just to show this because this is kind of ripped from the headlines. This is Chip Miller, who is a 3-star admiral. So our highest ranking officers in history was Jacob Loucks Devers, 4 stars, Chip Miller, 3 stars, and we have William Franklin, 2 stars. So I was at a place on Memorial Day at Gold Star Garden, and Chip Miller was there, and he was just kind of standing there. I mean, there's other people around him, and I got a chance to talk to a 3-star general. I've talked to 1-star generals before, but a 3-star general, especially when he's number 2 ranked in York County history. So I had a chance to go up and talk with him. He said, "Hey, you ought to look at the credits of Top Gun." And so I'm in there because I was head of the Pacific Fleet, or he had a big position at that time at the 3-star general. So I went and I saw Top Gun, Maverick, Top Gun. There he is, Vice Admiral DeWolf. I think it's H. Miller III. So York County, all roads lead to York County. I thought I'd throw that in. That's for free. I thought you might enjoy it. But I did get tingles talking to 3-star general, 3-star admiral. That was. Then we have Juba Early was the division commander. He was over the 11,000 troops, or most of those troops that were here when they invaded York in 1863. And he emerged in 1883, 20 years after the war. He said York raised only 72,000 of the 100,000 requisition levied, and York still owed him 28,000. But he got his math wrong. York only gave him 28,000, so he actually inflated what York gave him. So York probably should have paid him and walked away, but no. But York Gazette got it wrong too. York Gazette said that they actually was 48,000 that they paid him. I think it's 28,610 that were paid. The Confederates as part of the requisition. General John B. Gordon came here. John B. Gordon, who headed the major brigade commander, came through York, took down the flag in Center Square, went up to Wrightsville, and that was where the action took place in Wrightsville. And he came back in 1894, and he came back really somewhat as a hero's welcome. I'm just kind of wondering about that. What I wonder what you all would do if an enemy general came, who especially caused all this stuff we've been talking about. He was the main culprit in all this. Came back, 20, 25 years later. Should we slap him on the back and say, it's okay, it's war, we're brother against brother, that type of thing? Should we say, you cost me my livelihood, you cost me my father, I'm not going to go anywhere near you, I don't appreciate you, I don't appreciate what you did. What would you say to him? What would you all say? York welcome him back. Yeah.
I don't understand it.
No.
Then they say Southern County was sort of froze out.
Yeah. Most we voted more heavily against Lincoln in the Southwest than we did in the northern tier of York County. So yeah. Should we have forgiveness? I mean, this is a test, it's something to think through as you go home tonight, and how does that translate to other areas? Should we hold grudges? But the way I factored in is that Gordon was just not, he might seem gallant and so on. But here's Gordon because he presented himself as a gallant general when he was here. But here's Gordon in 1868. He was down South Carolina because the Democratic Party needed black voters to overcome the Republican vote in the Reconstruction year. So he needed blacks to back him, back Democratic candidates in that time frame. And he told this group that had is a mixed race group. He said, because we had bought you and paid our money for you. Why did we not free you? Because we bought you and paid our money for you. And then he says over here that, but if you attempt to inaugurate a war of races, you will be exterminated. So Gordon, this is the same Gordon we'll welcome back as a hero. Here's Gordon right after the war. And so I read stuff like this, I think, well, that would be a terrible thing to have someone thinking like that back in our midst, you know, so yes.
I think sometimes, you know, that all this about destroying, the statues and different things. Well, you know, there's some of them too in the South where like I would think, well, I'm not crazy about either, but it's history.
Right.
And I would rather than take those statues and keep them, some of them, keep them safe and put them in a museum
Right.
and safety, because it is history. The kids should know about that. They shouldn't hide all this. from
Right.
these people, and keep them like that. And yet maybe I wouldn't agree with that person with the statue or something, but yeah, you just don't destroy all history, and I would be extremely just livid if anyone touched Lincoln's. So,
Right.
you know, I mean, you know, and they might say, well, I didn't like him because they're in the South, you know, and they, so I don't think stuff history should be destroyed, even if
Right.
I don't like.
And to your point, that's why we're talking about this tonight, because we're not going to not talk about this. We're going to talk about this is a major thing that happened during this period that we're talking about. So why would we ignore it? And so I think that's what we have to do. We have to talk about it. And that's what we're doing here tonight. You know, unfortunately, we have a ton of other things to talk about too. But yeah, thank you for those comments. And I'm going to kind of just go over these in lightning round fashion. One of the things, the railroads came in, of course, in a big way after in that period that we're talking about. And you can see this came from Tom Yingling. This is very interesting. This is in 1895. You see most of the railroads in York County were in the southwestern area because of the iron ore there, a lot of iron ore mines. Now there was a Northern Central Railroad that came up, in the Ma and Pa Railroad. It wasn't called that then. Ma and Pa Railroad that came up as well. The Stewartstown Railroad's not on here for some reason. But anyway, the railroads did come in, but many of the railroads were over here in the southwestern part. That was new to me. I never thought about that. Today we have, in York County, we have 3 excursion railroads. 2 of them came up during the period we're talking about. The Northern Central Railroad came up earlier, and of course, was a major railroad during the Civil War. And then we have the Ma and Pa Railroad that came in, and the Stewartstown Railroad that came in during this industrial revolution. The road for women during this period, the Victorian era, was a difficult road. But this is one woman that we ought to remember, who came. Her husband died in 1865, and so she as a widow, she would get all these things you can see up there. She was a postmaster. She built stuff. She gave land away. Many of the prime things in York and Red Line today are on her former property. And she died a year before she could vote. So that was tough. And those factories that were burgeoning in this time frame, didn't mean they would hire everybody that was available. And this is a story from 1905. This is courtesy of Friends of Lebanon Cemetery. And you can see there's a story here that at this point, the only Black girl who was employed in a factory, there was only one Black woman employed in a factory in 1905. So it wasn't necessarily equal opportunity for everybody during this time frame that we're talking about by a long shot. But one of the things, we talked about the Ladies' Aid Society that grew up during the Civil War, and they did the bandages and did the things of military hospitals. But in this time period, from 1904 to about 1940, all these organizations came in, the Women's Club of York, the Catholic Women's Club of York, the Garden Club, the Young Women's Club of York, Junior League of York, Spring Grove Women's Club. So you can see during this period that the women's organizations, the associations, they kept coming together in a meaningful way to do meaningful work. I'm going to skip over this. You all, well, I got to talk about this because we did this. Scott and I talked about this, but this is just beyond. This is right over in Columbia. If you go to Columbia Crossing, there's a little dirt road that goes back into a meadow, and you can see the abutments for this old bridge. This was a bridge that burned in 1863. You can still see the abutments there. And so you can walk on the same area where all this activity was taking place. It's now a quiet meadow. But I always like this go and do stuff. I just urge you to go over there and take a look at this. This is really, you can go and fish in that pier. That guy's fishing on one of these piers. And there's other piers that go across the river. So I just couldn't resist that. This is the flagpole in Center Square has an interesting history. You can see in this 1860 shot, which might be by Glenn Alvin Goodrich, because it looks like it's from his the Goodrich Emporium. There's no flagpole, and then early in the war, that flag went up. Lewis Miller captured the surrender of York, and so that flagpole, played a role then. And then, it came down in 1887. Well, maybe 1888, but in 1887, the market sheds around it came down. There's the market sheds. The flagpole was up here. They pulled them down the center of the middle of the night because they had to clear the square because the trolleys had to come through there. And they had to move goods and people through that square. The flagpole remained up a little bit longer. And there's the flagpole during the celebration in 1887. I think that's August, September 1887. They used to hang streamers on it. See the streamers? They hung it during that big celebration. Really made good use of it. And then next year they took it down. The square then was empty, and it's been empty ever since. Hanover has interesting work. What Hanover has done, and they had market sheds in their square too, and they took them down in 1872. They replaced them with a fountain, and then that fountain was replaced with that equestrian statue, and that was in the center of the square for many years. They moved that, and now it's in the corner of the square. Again, in Hanover, their statement is the Civil War is important here. 300 people lost their lives or dead, wounded, and missing. This is a big deal to us. And again, in York Square, we don't have that type of thing. So you can read the landscape and tell what a town thinks about itself and what it says about itself. This is a great moment, and you all probably know this story, but I'll go ahead and tell it quickly. This is P.A. Small's house. P.A. was P.A.N.S. Small. Samuel Small was the philanthropist. P.A. Small was the businessman. I mean, they both were businessmen, but he lived here with his family. Samuel Small lived across the street. It's no longer standing. In 1912, which is during our period, the Lafayette Club came in 1912. And that was a men's only club, a white men's only club. And so they came in. And about the first black man was admitted there or became a member in 1998. So relatively recently. But meanwhile, the club closed and became the York College Center for Community Engagement. And and in that they had an art exhibit by Philia Chambliss. And she drew this picture here, drew this art piece here of John Aquila Wilson. And this young lady here, Nakia Wilson, came in one day. I think she was there visiting, maybe a part of a class. So she came in there and saw her, I think it's 3 times great grandfather, hanging on the wall. She said, "That's my grandfather." So she couldn't have been in this building. He couldn't be in that building. He lived until he was the last Civil War veteran to die in York County in 1942. So he couldn't have gone in that building, but there he is in the building. His great granddaughter, was able to see him in there. I think it's a wonderful turn of events there. We're going to talk about here real briefly about the manufacturers, because we do have to talk about this. I know this is hard to see, but this is 1999. Stephen Smith helps us with this. And you can see A.B. Farquhar, 510 employees, #1 in 1899. We have York Manufacturing Company second with 507. Almost did it, just three shy of A.B. Farquhar. And York Manufacturing Company is still around. Here's all the names of it, and it's now Johnson Controls. So it grew up during this time period that we're talking about. And here's all these industries that have large number of employees. So it gives you an idea of the breadth and growth after the Civil War. Here's a couple of things. I want to talk about A.B. Farquhar here. And this is from his autobiography, The First One in the Hardest. And he talks about that early in the Civil War, my own factory was turning out fully twice as much as before the war, and that was more or less the conditions of all lines of manufacture. So his factory is humming during the Civil War. So in 1862, the Antietam campaign was in place. He thought the Confederates in the town thought the Confederates might come up to York in 1862, a year ahead of when they did. So anybody know what Parker did at that point? He rode down to meet them. In 1862, he kind of did a prequel to what he would do in 1863. He rode down and met with Fitz Lee, cavalry commander down there. And he says, is it true, I asked Fitz Lee, that you're going to York? I'm interested because I have some property there. No, he doesn't say, I'm interested because we have a great town there and women and children live there, and we don't really want you to come through here. We're proud of what we've done here. I have some property here. And Fitz Lee said, no. So we're not going to go through there. So we come up to the next year, 1863. This is when the Confederates are out in Abbottstown, out in Farmers area, near today's York Airport. And we have this meeting, and we have Parker writing that first he said, he argued that we could make a good deal. He's arguing to the Committee of Safety, which is a group of non-elected people who are trying to figure out what to do with the Confederates about 20 miles away or coming towards York in late June 1863. And Parker wrote that we could not make a deal. He argued that we could make a good deal, better bargain with them than we could after they saw how little of our property we have been able to move. It's all about property with him, right? Talked about property the year before, and now he's arguing, look at all the property we couldn't move. You could easily say it must be he's concerned about his own factory. He had a young factories there. And he said, my plan, however, was not seriously entertained. Then I told them I would take the responsibility of going anyhow, which I did. He rode out and kind of forced York's hand in the surrender. York's, David Small and others went with him out, and they cut the deal later that night. But he kind of forced them into the deal. And what was his motivation? He was concerned about, property. And, so this is the mind of this guy, A.B. Parker. And I think this is important to understand this period we're talking about. Many of you have seen this. I've used this in many presentations. This one off to the left. And he goes that York was distinctly northern, but not bitterly anti-Southern. The community felt that slavery was wrong in principle. At the same time, being acquainted with many slave owners, we also knew that slavery was better in practice than in theory, and that the planter who was cruel to his Negroes was a rare exception. Okay, so that he's taking that position. Then he makes this comparison. No matter what his personal disposition might be, slaves were so very expensive that it would be as ridiculous to maltreat them as to maltreat a stable of blooded horses. So he's comparing enslaved people with horses. So he's saying, okay, this is 100 years ago. He's an older man, and he made a mistake. So just to make sure that we understand where he's coming from, about 5 paragraphs later, he's still on this topic. It often happens that the less you know about a subject, the more fanatical you can become. It's hard to hate a man who you know. And then he goes and says, if the writer of Uncle Tom Cab and Harry Beecher Stowe had resided in the South, then she wouldn't have written a book, or wouldn't have written as she did. And John Brown would have known the people in Virginia. He would have known that they weren't going to revolt, that they were in the main, this is talking about enslaved people. They were in the main more interested in 3 meals a day than in political theory. See what he's getting at? The people that are enslaved really aren't hurting much. He's completely missing the fact that enslaved people are hurting a lot. They don't have their freedom. That's the biggest deal of all. He's completely missing that. And he said more interested in 3 meals a day than political theory. So this is the mindset in York County and during this period. This is 1922. He's writing this only 100 years ago. So here we have a contrast here. I'm down to the last 2 slides, Adam, so we're coming to an end here. And so we have 2 examples here. We have Parker. We have Scott Mingus talking about Parker, and Scott Mingus says Alone without authority to speak for the council, he rode off to Habitstown in the early afternoon. So he went off to cut a deal with the Confederates who were coming towards us. So he's riding west towards the Confederates. And here we have in Wrightsville, John B. Gordon's troops, the guy we celebrated, in 1894. Here we have John B. Gordon's troops coming at the Wrightsville Bridge. And we have a black man in the trenches defending the bridge. He was killed, as we know that story. But this story isn't as well known, and Scott tells this. Sitting on the bridge was one old Negro to whom was entrusted the duty of igniting the fuse, sat very coolly on the edge of the pier smoking a cigar. Obviously, he would like that fuse with a cigar, right? So here you have this black man who had the whole John B. Gordon's troops coming right at him, sitting coolly. He was waiting. He was ready to fight, by trying to blow up the bridge. As it turns out, as we know, the bridge didn't blow up. They had to set it on fire. But he was going to light the fuse that tried to undermine the bridge, so only one span would drop in the water. So we have him sitting there bravely. We have A.B. Farquhar going the other direction, trying to cut a deal. How would we be under pressure? If we're faced with times like this, what types of decisions would we make? And that's one of the reasons why we study history, is so we can learn from them, and we can get these experiences, and maybe we'll make a different decision if we're faced with such things. And this is the last slide. And this is the goat. This is another goat. This is S. Morgan Smith. Okay, we're talking about heroes. The black man on the pier. We're talking about Samuel and Isabel Small. Here we have another hero, S. Morgan Smith, and we'll end on this. S. Morgan Smith, Stephen H. Smith drew this graphic over here. S. Morgan Smith was a Moravian pastor, and it was during the war. What did S. Morgan Smith do during the war? Anybody know? What's that?
Railroad.
No, he was a pastor. He was a Moravian pastor. He became a chaplain for the Union Army. Joined the military, became a chaplain. And then after the war, he got into industry, and he founded, or was there at the beginning of York Manufacturing Company, which is today what? Johnson Controls. So he helped found Johnson Controls. And then he helped found S. Morgan Smith, which became Alice Chalmers Boyd. Precision Components, American Hydro, all these were kind of offshoots of the companies that he founded, and Precision Calibration. So there's a hero, didn't have to serve, he did as a chaplain. Then he came and did found all these big companies. And we had this image of A.B. Farquhar, who founded that one company that riding away. He confronted the challenge, joined the army, did this after the war. A.B. Farquhar rode away to surrender to protect his factories. I think that it's interesting. I would leave it to how would we do? What would we do if we are faced with similar types of decisions? It may not be an enemy coming towards us, meaning a force, a military force, but maybe there's other things that are coming at us. How would we react? Would we be on the right side? Would we do what is brave and right, or would we negotiate? Try to seek some type of something to save out of self-interest. How would we act? Self-interest or out of courage? So thank you all. Any questions or comments? For all that, anything you anybody want to debate anything there?
What was amazing, the influence of A.B. Farquhar and guys like that, how they even to today, their influence is being built. I know some of the stories that have just done about the refurbishing of the George Creek waterway and all. A.B. Farquhar had a plan back then for improving the waterway and using that as an economic driver back in those days.
Right.
And he also wanted to help what he called the gutter kids, which he called the black kids in those days.
Right. The interesting thing about Farquhar is, and I wouldn't wish this on anybody, but he those machines that he was trying to protect, his machine shops, his industry, he died because of the machine. He was walking across Country Club Road and was hit by an automobile, and he was an invalid for the last couple of years of his life, and he ended up dying in about 1925. sad, but interesting, just interesting nonetheless, that the very things that he fostered ended up killing.
I think, Baltimore, manufacturing, conveyors for the postal service.
Right.
And my mother worked in the unemployment agency there on, South North George Street, on the right-hand side of the going down.
Right.
They were on, I guess they had the whole building, but I see that's all going down.
Yeah, and this isn't a rain on A.B. Farquhar, it might sound like that, but the A.B. Farquhar, his company, he died in 1925, and his company lasted through World War II. And they were very much part of the work plan, very good, very skillful in making, and that might be what you were talking about there. They went out of business, they sold to Oliver in about 1953, and then those buildings became, Oliver then abandoned buildings, and they were torn down. And now there's office buildings along that part of North George Street. So Farquhar's company did in some ways gain some degree of redemption in World War II. They made things, they were expert machinists, and they made things that really were handy for the war. They won E awards for excellence for the work that they did. Yeah. Questions, comments?
This Facebook question from Bill Landis.
Oh.
And
Hi, Bill.
he's asking if you could talk a little bit about maybe years timeframe of school segregation in North.
Oh, that's a big topic, and probably ought to have Jeff Kirkland, who's here, talk about that. But essentially, and because of the migration from the South, there was a need for as we talked about, two segregated elementary schools in 1931. So they built the two segregated schools, but the junior highs weren't segregated. Bonnie Grimes would say, yeah, I went to both Quilla Howard and Smallwood schools, but then when I got to Hannah-Penn, I was there with I was with mixed race kids. And so, it was mainly the segregation, at least in that part of history, was in the elementary school level. And then whenever Brown came in 1954, then full integration took place. And those schools were later demolished. They were only in use for 30 years, and as segregated schools from 1931 to 1954, or somewhere like that. So that's a very simple explanation. Jeff, anything else to add?
Yeah, that's about right. I was one of the first classes that attended Princess Street School.
Right.
When they desegregated that one in 1953, right before Brown was the Board of Education.
Yeah, Jeff Kirkland was just saying that he went to Princess Street School, and that's when it was integrated in about 1953. So, yeah. Great. And yes.
Follow up that, were the middle schools not segregated because not everyone went on to the elementary to middle school, or they just had a bigger facility that they were able to.
I mean, it's a facility, but I still could never come up with a rhyme or reason why it was
Yeah.
after this. Although with a couple of articles of Reverend Monty, for instance, he was fighting against them having separate classes at Hannah-Penn. So in the class at that time, when they first were going there together, some of the classes were separate classes.
Right. I know that I worked with Bonnie Grimes on his autobiography, and he was, whenever he talked about going to the junior high, this was a moment for him because they would get hand-me-downs from the white elementary schools. One time there was a page 22 was ripped out of one of his books at Smallwood School, and the teacher said, "Oh, just turn to 11 twice." When he got to junior high, he talked about this is kind of a physical thing. He had to walk from the Noel School, which is on East Princess Street, about 5 or 6 blocks to Smallwood School, a youngster. And Smallwood School is near York High, where York High is today. And he said, because whenever he got to an intersection, his white friends would go over to Noel School, which is now Community Progress Council. They would go over there. He had to walk 5 or 6 blocks. By the time he got to the Hannah-Penn School, middle school, there was like heat ducts, and he would huddle over those and thaw out, and then he had to walk to Smallwood, which wasn't that far after that. But but to get to the middle school was an achievement. You could just see that he felt that way, and it was. And he didn't talk a lot about the fact it was integrated. He just felt like at middle school, the education was so much better there than what he was getting at his elementary school. Other questions? Yes.
I just want to make a comment.
Yes.
I look forward to your articles every Sunday in New York City News in the viewpoint section.
Yes.
Newspaper, and you have quite often you've written about some more topics.
Yes.
And you wrote a very nice article on the battle to preserve the Richland House, the land Susquehanna Discovery Center to please showcase properties rich in virgin food. And I could go on. I have here the article of York's Confederate surrender. A.B. Barker labor to justify his role in this act.
Yeah, if you want to read all about it, A.B. Barker, I wrote about him. You know.
So I really, having been the program director for the Civil War Roundtable for the last 15 years, and having worked with you and Scott Mingus, and you're bearing together with your books, I really actually was calling you the York County history defenders.
Oh,
With
thank
your
you.
books, and I really look forward to all your articles. And you've written a lot about the Underground Railroad. So
Yeah.
thank you for your interest. I appreciate it.
Thank you. And we have such a rich others to draw from. Jeff Kirkland, the things that Adam and Nicole do in the archives that we can go in there. I was just in there last week to do something on what's called the conspiracy of 1803, and I wrote about that this week. So we just are surrounded with such a rich history community here. You can't help but to kind of be uplifted by it. So thank you very much. Yes.
I was just thinking the other week when I had someone go off that segregated schools. And I'm so glad I didn't know this at the time, that I was in school, first grade in 56. And Black children were in my school. East of Lancaster, in a little tiny town. And so I didn't think anything about it. One of my best friends was a little Black girl in second, third grade. And when I came to York, to York College, and that's why I came here. Well, then with friends around, York, they were talking about this segregation, and I thought, what? I thought that was way back, in 18 something, not 1950s or something.
Right.
To me, and all the prejudice, and I just couldn't believe it, and it still bothers me today. But I'm so glad that I was real young when I learned to be able to just feel normal. I mean, it's no big deal having a Black person in school or next year or any place. Because some of the ones my age are not much older can still have, once in a while a word mark or something. And so I don't know why we were allowed to have Black kids in our school in the 50s, but yet York and other cities around still have a problem.
And really, your comments kind of support what I was saying, that when you have a group of talking about the Civil War, as we're doing here tonight, as Kathy and Linda and others have done since the late 1990s, you talk about things like you just talked about. You talk about race and so on. You talk about discovering people that look different than you, and they really aren't. And you have that type of discussion like you just were talking about. If you don't talk about the Civil War, you're going to have a vacuum on that type of thing. And I think York County did for much of the 20th century, because we just did what people weren't writing about it. They weren't talking about it. Whether they were in Hanover and they were in Wrightsville, they weren't in the greater York area. And so I think that is really what I'm saying, is we're here tonight talking about these really tough things that we talked about Parker and so on, because we're talking about the Civil War, and that type of stuff just comes out of it, and it should, because that's what really caused the Civil War. So thank you for sharing that. That's really, really great. Thank you. Anything else? Okay. Thanks. Thank you all very much.